Hello everyone. In this video we're going to talk about mechanisms of gas exchange. In mammals, we need a steady input of oxygen in order to do cellular respiration. So we can break our gas exchange down into three simple steps. The first one obviously is breathing or respiration, bringing oxygen in through the nose or mouth and down into the lungs, and then obviously the removal of CO2. We can't just leave the oxygen in our lungs. We have to transport it throughout our entire body. So our second step is transport of the gases by our blood. And then the third step is exchange of the gases with the body cells. This is where that interstitial fluid will come into play. So oxygen will leave the capillary, pass through the interstitial fluid into a cell and then into a mitochondria to perform cell respiration. And carbon dioxide, the waste product of cell respiration, will travel in the exact opposite manner. Fish are at a little bit of a disadvantage when it comes to gas exchange because water only holds about 3% of the amount of oxygen that air would. So they do have an answer to this though. In order for a fish to do gas exchange, water will flow into the fish's mouth and then it passes out through the gills. And as the water moves out through the gills will pick up oxygen. In order to get the maximum amount of oxygen out of the water, the fish will use what's called a counter-current gas exchange. Okay, so this is how this is going to work. As the water flows in through the mouth and out the gills, it's going to allow oxygen to fuse into the blood. So this will be the water flowing from mouth through the gills back out into the surrounding body of water. Down here is representing the bloodstream. So this is blood returning from the fish's body. It's going to be very oxygen poor because all the oxygen was used in cell resp. This is where the blood will pass through the gill and then go back to the fish's body, now oxygen rich, to redo cellular respiration. Okay, so this is where the counter current comes in play. The water flows in this direction and the blood flows in the opposing direction, counter current. Why is that? You know that oxygen diffuses from high to low. So when the water first comes in, it has all its available oxygen. Okay, in the blood right here, the blood's been collecting oxygen from over here, so it's at its highest amount. So oxygen will still diffuse from water to blood. And if you keep going down the line, oxygen will still go from high to low. Now imagine for a second they were flowing in the same direction. So the water was flowing this way and the blood was flowing this way. Okay, the blood would come in, oxygen poor, the partial pressure maybe 5, but the water would be 100. So here it'd be great. Oxygen would flow right on in. Okay, but as we moved, still fine. Look at what would happen. Pretty soon, oxygen would leave the blood and go back into the water. We don't want that. So that's why the fish does the counter current gas exchange. All right, let's talk about gas exchange in humans. So how does your body know to increase your rate of respiration or to decrease it? Well, it knows to increase it because, believe it or not, what it measures is carbon dioxide. And what it specifically measures is pH of the blood. Because when carbon dioxide mixes with your cerebral spinal fluid, the medulla oblongata, which is so fun to say, basically the middle of your brainstem, it will pick up the drop in pH. So carbon dioxide plus water in the cerebral spinal fluid makes carbonic acid. This will indicate to the medulla oblongata, okay, we have too much carbon dioxide, so therefore too little oxygen. And it will indicate to the lungs to increase the rate of respiration, but also the heart to beat faster to get that oxygen to all the cells within the body quicker. All right, you also have nerve signals close to your heart as well that will indicate CO2 and O2 levels. And that will also send the information to your medulla, which will then pass it back to your lungs and your heart to increase respiration and the beating of the heart. Oxygen and carbon dioxide flow in opposite directions, and they do this by partial pressure. all gases move from high pressure to low pressure. So what's partial pressure? Kind of a, I don't know, lame explanations. Let's say you have a bag filled with gases, and collectively those gases emit a pressure. Like if you blow up a balloon or something. So let's say in this bag I have oxygen and carbon dioxide and nitrogen, methane, all sorts of different gases. Collectively, all those gases make up the pressure within the bag, but each gas is responsible for its own pressure. So the partial pressure of oxygen, the partial pressure of carbon dioxide, and oxygen will move from high to low, as will carbon dioxide. And that's how carbon dioxide and oxygen can move in opposite directions within your blood. So right here in the alveoli of the lungs, so this is air fresh from the outside, we're going to have a high amount of oxygen in the alveoli, but in the capillary, it will be lower partial pressure. So the oxygen will move from the alveoli into the capillary. The opposite will be true for carbon dioxide. Because of cellular respiration, you've produced a bunch of carbon dioxide and you used your oxygen. So the carbon dioxide will move from high partial pressure in the capillary to the low partial pressure of the alveoli so it can then leave the lungs. All right, once we get to the cells, so the oxygen is moved through the blood and it gets into like the tissues. Remember, within the cells, we've used our oxygen due to cell resp. So it's going to move from the capillary into those cells, and carbon dioxide will be created within cells because of it being the waste product of cell resp. So it's going to move out of the cell into the capillary. Okay, and then by the time we get up to the lungs, same thing. The oxygen will move back in, the carbon dioxide will move out, and that's all based on partial pressure. You guys already know that hemoglobin is how we carry oxygen within our blood. And you will also probably remember that hemoglobin is made up of 4 subunits. We call these hemigroups. Okay, so now we need to talk about the cooperative binding of hemoglobin. So let's say this is a hemoglobin molecule right here that is in your capillaries right next to your alveoli. So it's going to pick up an oxygen molecule. So this group will pick up an oxygen molecule. And what will happen is it will cause this portion of the hemoglobin to make a structural or conformational change, which will make it more likely to pick up an oxygen. That will cause this group to make a conformational change, which will make it more likely to pick up an oxygen. And you guessed it, which will cause this group to make a conformational structural change to make it more likely to pick up an oxygen. This is wonderful because no hemoglobin will then leave the lungs and travel through the blood half filled. We're going to carry 4 oxygen molecules. All right, so we get to a cell and we need to unload our oxygen. The same thing is going to happen for when we get rid of our oxygen. This oxygen molecule will get dropped off. It will then cause a structural change in this one to let go of its oxygen molecule. You guys can already see where I'm going with this, right? It's going to cause a conformational change for this group to drop off its oxygen molecule, which will then cause a conformational change for this one to drop off its oxygen molecule. So it's all or nothing. A hemoglobin molecule will be carrying all 4 of its oxygen molecules, or will release all 4 of its oxygen molecules. And this is called cooperative binding, and it's going to lead to the oxygen dissociation curve. So let's talk about that next. This graph represents the oxygen dissociation curve, or the Bohr effect. And I'll be honest, I always thought this was super amazing. Because if you think about it, how does your body know, all right, I need to drop off more oxygen to these cells because they're exercising, or I need to drop off more oxygen to the brain cells because they're taking a test and they're really working hard and they're going through a lot of glucose. How do we deliver oxygen where it's needed the most and don't waste it on cells that don't need it as much? Well, the answer is that oxygen dissociation curve. So let's go ahead and take a look at our axes. So on our y-axis is our hemoglobin saturation. So up here, that means the majority of our hemoglobin is holding on to, or that hemoglobin is holding on to all 4 of its oxygen molecules. And down here, it means the hemoglobin is letting go of its oxygen molecules. And remember, if it's letting go, it's going from the hemoglobin to a cell, so that cell can do cell respiration. All right, and then on the x-axis is our partial pressure of just oxygen. Okay, so if you look up here, this is where our hemoglobin is going to be saturated, and that's because we're at the lungs. We need that hemoglobin to be carrying the oxygen so it can carry it out to the cells. Okay, and then down here, we're letting go of our oxygen so it can pass from hemoglobin into the cell. Makes sense, right? Okay, so let's talk about shifting this curve. They call it the Bohr shift sometimes. All right, so if I'm looking at my center line right here, okay, and let's say I'm looking at partial pressure of 40. That means about 60% of my hemoglobin is saturated. But let's say I shift that curve to the right. All right, and I again go to the partial pressure of 40. Only about 50% of my hemoglobin is saturated. So by shifting my curve to the right, I am letting go of more oxygen, which means more oxygen can then be released and go into cells. So let's think about this. Why would I want a shift from holding on to my hemoglobin to letting it go? What could I be doing? Well, I could be exercising, which means an increase in carbon dioxide, because when I exercise, I would be creating more carbon dioxide because I'm doing more cell respiration. And as we talked about, an increase in carbon dioxide would also decrease my pH, would make me more acidic. Okay, now this is at a cellular basis, so this would just be in my muscle cells, not in my stomach cells. So my muscle cells could be shifted over here, but like my stomach cells are up here. So that means just my muscle cells are getting this increase in oxygen. Okay, the other thing is if I'm really working out and I'm feeling the burn, I could have more carbonic acid, which would add to this drop in pH or the increase in acidity. The other thing that will cause this curve to shift to the right is an increase in temperature. As you work out, you increase your temperature, and that would cause more oxygen to be dropped off. Really cool, huh? All right, so then let's talk about this. My curve could also shift to the left. All right, and look at that. This would be grabbing onto oxygen. So another thing that can cause you to shift your curve, I'm going to go back for a second to the right, is the accumulation of something called DPG, which is a byproduct from a fetus. So this would cause mom to shift to the right, dropping off more oxygen. And at the same time, fetal hemoglobin's right here. And what fetal hemoglobin is going to do is it's going to shift the curve to the left, which means it's literally grabbing oxygen. So the fetus is grabbing oxygen and mom is dumping oxygen. And that's why when you're pregnant, you lose your breath really easily. And take it from me, that's a true story. Muscle cells also have the ability to grab onto oxygen, so they're going to go ahead and pull that oxygen from the blood. And this is how your body can determine and pinpoint exactly where oxygen is needed most and to drop it exactly where it's needed. It's pretty magical stuff, huh? We've addressed how oxygen is carried in the bloodstream. Let's talk about carbon dioxide. Most carbon dioxide in the blood enters red blood cells. Some of the carbon dioxide will combine with hemoglobin, but other carbon dioxide, it will react with water, making carbonic acid. And remember, that's going to be what lowers that pH. Okay, it then breaks apart into hydrogen ions and bicarbonate. And this is obviously a reversible reaction. The hemoglobin is going to bind the hydrogen ions just to maintain that pH of your blood. And then when this all gets back up to the lungs, they'll reassociate back into carbon dioxide and leave the blood and get exhaled. And that's how we do gas exchange.